Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn series presented by the Florida Green Building Coalition. My name is CJ Davila and I'm the Executive Director. For today's webinar, we'll be covering how to write a green ordinance. And the speaker has requested that we save all the questions till the end. So please use your chat or your question and answers or raise your hand and we'll get to your questions as we end towards the end of the webinar. A little bit about the Florida Green Building Coalition. We are a third-party building certification program, which is designed to move Florida forward. We have over 300 members currently. We've certified over 33,000 projects. We are state-specific criteria. We're a flexible program offering a lot of different options in terms of certifying your building or your local government. We are a non-for-profit, and we've been in business for 23 years. The Lunch and Learn series is our ongoing monthly webinar series, which covers different topics associated with green building within the state of Florida. All of the recordings are saved to our website, the FGBC website, which is www.floridagreenbuilding.org, as you see on the screen below. We also host them on our YouTube channel, Florida Green Building Coalition web channel on YouTube. If you'd like to join us next month, we'll be presenting Dustin Stephanie with the University of Florida. He's going to cover why they've been using the FGBC program on campus. For today's webinar, I'm very excited to introduce John Kent Edwards. He's the Sustainability Officer for the City of Delray Beach. And Kent's been doing a great job of really moving forward with a green initiative for the City of Delray Beach. And so he did a phenomenal job of really starting at the bottom, starting at the groundwork and putting together a really good course of action to finally get everybody on board with this green ordinance in the city. And so we were really excited when he agreed to kind of share his experience with our local governments to see how he can help and some pointers he can give you when you're developing your local green ordinances. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Kent Edwards.
Hey, CJ. Thank you so much for that intro. And I'm really glad to be here today to talk about the city's green building ordinance. It was quite a trip, and I'm going to try to give a lot of detail because I think a lot of the experiences that people will have will be very similar. So hopefully you are seeing my screen now. Is that the presentation screen?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So I will be presenting on the City of Delray Beach Green Building Ordinance. And my name is Ken Edwards. I have my contact information there. It was a lot of process and a lot of different interests that were involved. So I tried to put together a detailed timeline, and I really hope that that's useful to all of you. So questions that we should be answering today. What was the foundation? Where did we start from on the green building ordinance? What were the steps that we went through and the obstacles that we faced? Who are stakeholders and participants? And ultimately, what did we come up with on the ordinance that passed, and what were the provisions? So back in January of 2009, a group of citizens formed a green task force. This was not a formal city board. It was a group of interested citizens, and there was support from the city for space and a little bit of staff as far as doing research and minutes. But they wrote a report, which I still refer to. It had extensive recommendations regarding sustainability and resilience. One of those was to write a green building ordinance. And it was out of this task force that the city's Green Implementation Advancement Board, which is a formal city board, was actually formed. So in 2015, 6 years later, a green building ordinance was passed by the city. This was only applicable to the central business district. So those familiar with Delray, Atlantic Avenue, and some neighborhoods that come off of that, even including the railroad district to the west. So it was 20% or so of the city. The certification requirement was silver or equivalent. And I'll point out that that equivalent language was in the ordinance that was passed back in 2015. And that'll be a major point later on. So central business district, silver or equivalent certification, and 50,000 square foot threshold for buildings. So larger buildings in central business area, and it's silver lead or equivalent. That was the reference. Then in 2019, the Green Implementation Advancement Board wrote a formal memo and recommended to the commission that the ordinance be revised. The specific recommendations was for the whole city, a 5,000 square foot threshold on all types of building, and a gold lead or equivalent certification. So those recommendations were taken by the commission, and they gave direction that the ordinance be revised. And also along the way in February of 2020, during the normal revision process, the comprehensive plan for the city was revised, and there were many goals, policies, and objectives that are consistent with sustainable and resilience practices. A few of them here in the conservation, sustainability, and resilience element: increase green buildings, reduce electricity, increase renewable projects, and a different goal in that same element: promote a green economy in the healthy communities, healthy buildings, housing, incorporate sustainable practices and flood elevations, and then in capital improvement. So well over half, probably more like 3/4 of the elements had sustainable and resilience, and that was passed, and we are using that comp plan still today. I came on board with the city in May of 2020, and the writing of the green building ordinance was one of the first projects that was given to me as one to move forward. So we met with staff, and one of the major things that I found was that the way Delray has handled these kinds of recommendations, the write-up is done exactly the way it was presented in front of the commission. And I honestly had some concerns with the 5,000 square foot threshold and the gold level. I could foresee that there was going to be some questions about that, but we went forward after a bit of staff discussion and back and forth, went forward with an ordinance that incorporated the way the Green Board had recommended. We went to multiple different boards in the city. These are official boards. All of these were public meetings, and generally had a very positive response from them. And they all voted in favor of moving the ordinance forward, but there were comments and concerns that were voiced, even though ultimately everyone supported. Concern for single-family residences and smaller developments. So with that, the thought of maybe moving that square foot threshold up. There were suggestions for lowering the certification level from gold, and also throughout the process, we heard a lot of comments and suggestions on the use of incentives to higher certification levels. And that's a very good suggestion. I'll talk about that later on and some of the complications with that, though. There was one group that did not support. This was the Downtown Development Authority, and they had some very pointed questions. It is really a business group from the downtown district, very much the central business district. And so already being subject to that, to the existing ordinance, they had concerns for moving the square footage down to the 5,000. They suggested phasing in the requirements to give the community more time to get ready, to get used to those requirements, and suggested a lot more stakeholder input. And that's where you can never do too much outreach. They can be difficult meetings. There will be hard questions. I mean, in the DDA meeting, one of the particular comments that I remember very well was being told point blank that solar energy did not work on small projects. Solar energy would only work on the larger, like electric company kinds of projects, but it just was not mature enough and would not work on small projects. So getting around those kinds of comments, in a straightforward, cooperative way can be difficult. But the outreach component is really the one of the main things that's going to make sure that an ordinance can get through, and an ordinance that will be agreeable and I think be successful in the end. So with all of that input, there still was the belief that we had to, sorry, I'm saving energy with my light. Even with all of that input, the belief still was that we had to take the ordinance as it was without any changes. I did ask for some individual briefings of commissioners, and there were some short discussions, but overall, the ordinance went forward the way it was, without a whole lot of interaction with the commission. And that was on July 6, 2021. There weren't a whole lot of comments. There was really no discussion. There was one comment in particular of the few that said that they thought that the ordinance was aggressive, and that was a red flag to me. But we still had to go forward with second reading at August 10, and at that second reading, there was a robust discussion. And also, let me mention the way Delray does legal readings of ordinance. There is no presentation at the first reading. It is just for a public meeting and out there for the public to be able to see. The commissioners can discuss, but they don't have to. It is the second reading where the formal presentation is made. And in this case, there was a lot of back and forth, and the concerns that we had heard in the past about the square footage threshold and the level of certification, comments were made that the community was concerned about the ordinance, and ultimately a vote on second reading wasn't taken. Direction was given to hold additional public input, which I think was really a very good thing. And on August 14th, 2021, we had a public outreach meeting. There was good attendance of probably 30 to 40 community representatives. A lot of them were from the development community, but there were also some environmental interests that showed up. And the points that we heard were familiar. Cost was a very big comment that was made. We were in the pandemic, or beginning to come out of it, but still having some effect, and supply chain issues were still in place. So there was a lot of concern about disruption to an economy that was still trying to recover. Concerns for smaller developments, the threshold level, certification level. There were a lot of questions about equivalency for the certification programs. And my initial position had been keep the language that was in the ordinance. It said LEED or equivalent, but really it was clear from the comments that we were getting that in some way clarification on that, or change in the language, was going to have to happen, because kept having to address the comment, why are we being forced to use LEED? LEED is very, very difficult. It's very specialized amongst the certification programs, it has a higher cost than some of the others. So equivalency was a big issue, and I have a slide coming up that I'll comment some more. Also, tiers and incentives, which tiers and phasing are really the same thing. And suggestion, why doesn't the city try to use incentives to get the green buildings going? And really, when I would ask, well, what kind of incentives do you think will work? I never did get a clear and precise kind of suggestion. All of them revolved around refunds, which is a budget issue. And as everyone knows, during the pandemic, there was issues with taxes. So funding was going to be a difficult issue. Then development kinds of incentives, which whenever those come before the commission, there are some that believe that it's appropriate and should encourage business, but the precedent that's set by those and other kinds of development want to use them, they can be controversial also. The other area for incentives really is expedited processing, and we were just entering a e-permitting update phase. So making a promise on processing time frame was going to be difficult. So incentives, even though it's a very good suggestion, I did not have a clear idea or get clear input on one that would work for us well at this at that point of writing. So we had that public meeting and then went back to commission with a update presentation. I thought that it went very well, and we did make progress. Some additional comments that came out of the commission were related to the permitting process and how our staffing level and permitting processing timeframe, they did not want to be affected by the green building ordinance. Again, there was a lot of talk about cost and supply chain, and some of those issues are going away, but you'll still get questions about cost, but I think that those can be addressed. And also a section suggestion that I had made that I think is really important. When a green building ordinance with any kind of new requirement, process requirement is put into place, then a future effective date is going to have to be, because at least some, if not most, of the development projects are going to have a timeline where plans are put in place, property is purchased, and as everyone knows, the location of the property can have points associated with it in certification programs. And before the design phase happens, certainly, then a developer or builder needs to know what kind of requirements they're going to face. So a future effective date, and ultimately we landed on a year, is a very, very important feature. So for equivalency, for the December presentation, having heard the questions about equivalency, I put together this matrix. I reached out to the 4 certifying agencies that ultimately were specifically referenced in the ordinance. And this is an accurate slide, but I really wish that I had made it simpler, taken out the commercial table, which really the only difference is that the NGBS doesn't have a line on there. I think I could have helped the presentation because it's a difficult, complicated topic, and simplification is a really good tool. So I would have reduced this down to just the lower table, but ultimately in the end, even that table got reduced, and I'll show that in a minute also. So after the December 2021 presentation to commission, acknowledgement that progress has been made, but still comments and concerns being voiced. Between January and March, I individually reached out to each of the developers that had provided comments to the City Commission. And anyone that I had seen on an email, certainly anyone that spoke at a commission meeting, any person that I heard referenced in those discussions, I made a list. and followed up with them. I had a couple of small group meetings, and all of the points that have been presented thus far in the presentation, we talked about in a very straightforward kind of manner. And I personally have a long background in regulatory programs, and I think that it's very important for the regulated public to at least acknowledge the importance. I mean, preferably having them on board is the best of all worlds, but there at least needs to be an understanding, and concerns need to be addressed. So in those 3 months, there were multiple times where we met, and I think that's some good progress. It certainly was more clear to me the shape that the ordinance needed to take, and really what the biggest concerns were for the community. And then around those concerns, I organized another outreach event. This was a hybrid, so in person for Delray community people, and had representatives from FGBC and NGBS virtually attend. CJ was on that, and had Jennifer Languel present, and similarly for NGBS had executive representation and a well-recognized certifier. And they went into detail with the small group of developers that attended through the process of the certification, the credit categories and what kinds of things gave credit, the costs for the certification, and really started to get into how some of the lower levels of the certification really had very, very little cost, if any, cost differential. And one example that I like to use in that, because it is very widely thought that green buildings are going to cost more. But for example, landscaping, almost any facility, or every facility, is going to have landscaping. The native plants are going to cost about the same as some that don't provide native habitat value. And also grading of the ground. You can grade so that you have a swale, or you can grade so that you retain water in some areas, and you can get points through the systems, and it does not cost anything else. It just is an upfront thought and design. So having those kinds of presentations, it really brought out what the development community already knew, in fact. And I did get some comments to that effect, that the community was very much in favor of green buildings. They were just concerned about the way that it was going to be required of them. And so this meeting had a particular benefit in that case, and really appreciate FGBC being a part of that. It made all the difference in the world. They showed the ease of process, and I think a lot of the cost concerns were addressed in there also. On July 9th, between March and July, we were working internally as staff on the ordinance, and we were still having questions about exactly how to formulate, and we're having difficulty in scheduling the time to come back and do first reading again. So our Green Board has an annual presentation, and they did that in early May or April. And there were questions about their priority points. So I did a follow-up presentation on that, and took the opportunity to focus a lot on the green building ordinance and greenhouse gases. Those were priorities that were made, but more than half of the presentation focused on these. And I think, again, it helped take a step forward, inform the commission. I think at that point they were hearing more positive from the development community. And ultimately, we worked through with staff and had a first reading on October 11th. And then on November 1st, had the second reading, which again had a presentation. And I'll go into the individual points. Most of the next slides are actually the slides with very little change from what was given at that November 1st meeting. But I'll just say in the end, the biggest discussion point amongst the commission was we need to make the green building ordinance stronger. But I'll give you the ending at the end. So some of the main features of the ordinance that was at second reading, there was a minimum level certification requirement for a tier from 15,000 to 50,000. So this was a new tier, would increase the number of buildings. We dropped down to a silver, took the existing requirement for central business district and spread it to the whole city. So there was an expansion of the existing and an add-on of a tier. And this square footage applies to one building or multiple buildings on one parcel or as a part of a development. So certainly some of the largest homes that we have would be subject, but in almost any development, commercial or residential, would have been subject to the ordinance as revised. Because of concerns that were voiced about historic buildings and the extra requirements that historic buildings already have to jump through, and the fact that historic buildings and a lot of renovations, if they preserve the materials in the existing building, then that's already a green feature. So we did not have those kinds of buildings subject to the ordinance, and I did feel good about that, certainly as this next step in our green ordinance process. We had a 1 year after passage effective date to give businesses plenty of time to accommodate. We had a provision for reevaluation of the ordinance, and this was the one change that ultimately was made between what was presented and what was passed. There had been a 4-year reevaluation that I'd written in, and it was reduced to 2, which is a short time frame, but I think gives us the ability to gather consensus and make some changes that can improve the ordinance, and made it clear that the ordinance applies to city projects also. That goes a long way when people know that what is being put on the community, the government is also subject to. Other provisions we clarified and put in specifically that 4 certifying entities are acceptable, and this equivalency matrix was what was presented in the ordinance. So it is the simplified version, and it just has the lower 2 levels here. And in fact, from the information that I got from the 4 programs, there is greater consistency at these lower levels than when you get up to gold and platinum. And so you can address the cost and equivalency questions when you stay in the entry level or silver equivalent. All right, so effects and future considerations. Some of these I mentioned beforehand, but the ordinance was expanded to the whole city, which certainly is going to increase the number of buildings, plus a new tier to drop the square foot threshold down to 15,000. We did get a lot of questions about, well, why don't we include EV or solar ready? But in the research that I did, I really thought that we would need to go out and do more public meetings and public information on that. There's more technical aspects. What kind of buildings is it going to apply to? What is the threshold? What is the charger level for EVs, for solar ready? Some buildings aren't even recommended for solar because they don't have the incidence because of their orientation or whatever. So we addressed that comment from the commission, but it doesn't have a particular provision in the ordinance. But during the 2-year reevaluation period, it is one of the things that we can really take a look at and maybe borrow from other municipalities that have passed those kinds of ordinances. We emphasize that the ordinance is consistent with the Florida statute that requires governmental buildings to have a green building certification. But that Florida statute, as you know, is very generalized. So we put some detail on how the City of Delray Beach is going to do it. Our e-permitting program has been implemented and is stepping up that process. So we do feel confident that there will be no increase in processing time, and that was very important to the development community. And mentioned to the commission that this is a hot issue, that other municipalities are watching what we're doing, and we're going to share this information like we are today. So if they pass the ordinance, then it may well open the door for an even broader effect, and that was something that the commission really liked. And I ended the presentation leading into topics that I'm now addressing with them. Greenhouse gases is something that we have to address climate change. And if we have any hope of reaching the 50% reduction in net zero target dates, then we have to address our buildings and our transportation. And a good way to get started on that, to inform the public and actually start reducing carbon emissions associated with buildings, is to pass a green building ordinance. And so in the end, through a lot of discussion and some days when I was really concerned that we were not going to pass an ordinance at all, ultimately the vote was 5-0. And the ordinance was approved on November 1st of 2022 and goes into effect November 1st of 2023. And I hope that you got a lot out of that, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Kent. I wanted to take a minute and applaud and congratulate Kent for all his work on that ordinance and passing it. From our perspective, I think the reason he was successful is, number one, he did an amazing job of understanding the differences between the programs. And there are subtle differences, and it's important for you to understand those if you're trying to work on a green ordinance. So my suggestion would be to reach out to the different entities. We love interaction with cities and municipalities, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. I think also he did a great job of outreach, not only outreach to developers, but education to developers. As he mentioned in his example about the common misperception that building green makes it more expensive. And so those are some of the things that outreach and education to developers really goes a long way in allowing them to sometimes find out that it actually costs less in certain areas to incorporate more sustainable features within a building. So I think outreach and education is really, really key. And then in the end, it's a very flexible program, which provides the developer lots of opportunities. They can pick the certification program that works best for them. And it's going to allow for Delray Beach to really increase their building supply and quality of that building supply in the future. So once again, congrats, Kent, and we'll jump into questions. The first question is, what impact has the state had on limiting the autonomy of for municipalities to enact green ordinances throughout Florida? I don't know if you've seen that, Kent. I can say from our perspective, we have not seen that. We've seen some language pertaining to hurricane disaster recovery, where they're limiting some kind of the ability of municipalities to restrict certain things, but we have not seen that affect building certifications as of yet.
Yeah, we have not either. I mean, we did look at one bill in particular, but I think because of the buy-in that we had from the community and the 1-year time frame for implementation, there really is not an argument to be made that this makes the process more difficult. And since we are going for the entry level, even though I had a lot, actually I continue to have comments about why didn't we get a higher certification level, but I think that those wind up getting the buy-in, getting us started, and really take away from a criticism that this is problematic. It's too difficult for development to do. And I would tell you, for our developers here, ultimately, I heard from a few, but I think more generally in the community, they do see this and the way that this was done as something that's going to put them ahead of the game. They're going to have more opportunity to build more green buildings. And once you're into the process, you understand the credit system, you do multiple projects, then it's a marketing tool. We can do this, and for very little additional money, then we can get you a higher level. And something that I didn't touch on beforehand, CJ started to, is even if there is a small additional cost because of the reduction in the operational cost, that money is going to be paid back. So it's actually more value in a green building, and they're easier to maintain. So I think we have not seen a problem from state preemption. But I think some of that is because of the design of the ordinance, or going forward will avoid pitfalls because we have an ordinance that's very workable.
Okay, and then just as a note, we will be recording this webinar, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as our website. And then another question, the planning and zoning as well as building departments, were they involved at the community meetings? Was there a reference to existing energy codes and enforcement?
They were, for us, it's development services that includes planning and zoning and building permitting. And they were involved from the beginning of the writing of the ordinance. They were also involved in the October meeting that we had, and certainly did follow up with them during the process. What was the last part of that question?
Was there a reference to existing energy codes and enforcement?
There was discussion of energy codes. There were suggestions of pulling out particular building features like blower door tests or HERS ratings, or the EV and the solar requirements. But even though there was discussion of that, I was really a proponent of, if we go to the green building program, all of those will be available, but we'll leave the choice up to the developer themselves. Once we get the ordinance passed, then we can do educational programs on very specific topics and encourage our energy use. And in fact, the topic that I'm working on greatly now, on September 2nd, we have our biggest outreach event of the year, Climate and Art. And in September, I make 2 presentations to the commission talking about greenhouse gases, emission reduction targets, and a climate action plan. So, there's different ways to go about this, but for me, it was get the ordinance in place, get all of these different green aspects being incorporated, and then we'll focus on things like energy codes and energy efficiency.
And what role will FP&L be playing with developers?
We don't specify. So, I mean, again, within the green certification programs, there is the capability to buy certificates for green energy. So that would be a way that they could get certification, but we don't particularly specify, but we would welcome it.
And then this question may be a little too soon, but it says, what has been the savings in dollars from the green public buildings over the past couple of years in terms of electricity, water, et cetera? Does Delray Beach Finance Department keep track of this?
Right. Since the ordinance hasn't gone into effect yet, we wouldn't have that. But that's another one of the areas that I am working with another department, Public Works, and we are really just on the initial stages. I have a whole stack of bills up here, in fact, and we'll need to have a way to organize and deal with that information electronically. But we haven't started with that yet.
And so FGBC, we actually survey our local governments from time to time, And we do have some specifics in terms of dollars saved with some of the features and some of the design elements associated with the green building program. So I can send that to you, Phyllis, if you'd like.
Sure.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Here, yeah, just pop one up. As you mentioned, Public Works, has there been initiatives to extend bicycle infrastructure?
There is a multimodal transportation planning effort that went on. We had some changeover in staff, and I'm not sure exactly where that stands in the process. But there certainly was discussion of that, and again, like I've said with a couple of points, what's really nice about having the green building ordinance first is that all of these other excellent ideas can then be incorporated. And granted, this is a planning effort in the city, but if we make those opportunities better, then there's points that that developers can get by tying into that. So I'm not. I don't believe that made it all the way through the review and passage process.
Any additional questions for Kent while we have him? Okay, well, I thank you, Kent, for being on today and sharing your experiences. And I want to reiterate to everyone that the recording will be on our YouTube channel or on our website. And with that, thank you for attending today, and thank you, Kent.
Thanks, CJ.
Thanks. Bye-bye.